Let's end this lesson now with at least 2, if not 3 cheers for perfect competition. Here's the deal. We've proven that a perfectly competitive market does indeed yield the most efficient use and allocation of resources, as embodied in productive and allocative efficiency. Yet, we also know there are several obvious problems. For starters, perfect competition is rarely, if indeed ever, totally mirrored in reality. There are just too many restrictive assumptions to be met. Numerous buyers and sellers, a homogeneous product, free entry and exit, perfect information, and so on. Where in the real world can you ever find that? And as we have discussed, when one or more of these assumptions do not hold, we get any one of a number of market failures, ranging from perfect competition and externalities to the public goods problem. So you might ask, if perfect competition only very rarely exists in its pure form, why do we even bother to study it? Well, for one thing, perfect competition gives us that aforementioned benchmark against which we can measure the conduct and performance of our other 3 main forms of market structure: monopoly, oligopoly, and monopolistic competition. At the same time, the perfect competition model also gives us appropriate guidance as to when and how to intervene in the market to correct market failures, as well as how to measure our success at doing so. Of course, this leads us to the other major problem with perfect competition, and it is a big one politically. To wit, while the results of perfect competition may well be efficient, they are not necessarily always fair. This problem in equity lies in this far more subtle observation. The efficient allocation of resources achieved by perfect competition is contingent on the initial distribution of income across the rich, poor, and middle classes. Let me repeat that. The efficient allocation of resources achieved by perfect competition is contingent on the initial distribution of income. The key idea here is that if you change the distribution of income across the rich and middle class and poor segments of an economy and a society through income redistribution methods, you can actually get a very different efficient allocation of resources and, by implication, a very different consumption pattern. So now let's demonstrate our key idea that if you change the distribution of income, you can actually get a very different efficient allocation of resources, and by implication, a very different consumption pattern. And let's do so with an example. Consider then a country like Guatemala, where less than 5% of the people control over 90% of the wealth. The patterns of consumption in Guatemala between the very rich few and the far too many poor are likely to be starkly different. While the rich few can afford huge villas and fancy clothes and fleets of limousines and eat steak every night, many of the poor peasants live in rags and shacks, eat beans and rice, and can't even afford to buy bicycles. Now, in a world of perfect competition, that can be a perfectly efficient outcome. Yet, it is also true that if income were distributed more evenly in Guatemala, we'd see an equally efficient allocation of resources, but one with a very different and likely far more robust structure of demand. Indeed, a lot more people could afford to buy more housing and refrigerators and air conditioners and motor scooters and small cars, while the consumption of villas and limos and steaks would go way down. So which of these 2 equally efficient outcomes do you believe is more fair? To put this another way, which market outcome would you consider to be more equitable? And would you be willing to raise taxes on the rich to redistribute more income or wealth to the poor? Pause the presentation now to think about this, please, and maybe jot down a few notes and thoughts about this. Well, I suspect that many of you would opt in Robin Hood fashion for the Guatemalan society that had a more equal distribution of income. Well, some of you may take the position that the government shouldn't be meddling in matters of income redistribution. Here, the only thing I can tell you is that this type of what we call a normative question is not one that can be definitively answered either way strictly by the science of economics. In fact, in economics, it is important to distinguish between two types of questions: normative or prescriptive on the one hand versus positive or descriptive on the other hand. Thus, when we ask whether Guatemala should have a more equitable income distribution that would require transferring wealth from the rich to the poor, this is a normative or prescriptive question because it focuses on what should be. In contrast, positive or descriptive questions merely ask what is and not what should be. My point here in making this distinction is that normative questions are more properly the domain not of economists, but rather of politicians and philosophers and voters at the ballot box, or revolutionaries in the jungles or deserts or ghettos of the world. In contrast, the primary role of the economist is positive or descriptive analysis, describing what is rather than what should be. Having said that, however, positive descriptive economics nonetheless can offer great insights about how different types of government policies can affect the distribution of income and consumption. Therefore, positive economic analysis is essential in many normative policy debates. In the next lesson, we will provide considerable fodder for the great normative debates over imperfect competition. In the meantime, please remember that economics is not something to be memorized, but rather something to conceptualize. So as you study it, think about it too. Your job and your business just might depend on it. From the University of California, Irvine, I'm Peter Navarro.